The Vatican City was shrouded in an uneasy stillness as reports emerged that Pope Francis, at the age of 88, had been rushed to Rome's Gemelli Hospital in critical condition. It was an alarming development for the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, whose frail health had long been a topic of concern. Initial reports from Vatican insiders described the Pope experiencing severe breathing difficulties, a condition eerily similar to an asthma attack but with an intensity that doctors found alarming. The decision to transfer him to the hospital was made swiftly, with medical personnel scrambling to stabilize him. Pope Francis, known for his resilience despite ongoing health struggles, was placed under intensive medical supervision upon arrival at Gemelli. Doctors immediately administered high-flow oxygen therapy to assist his breathing, a necessary intervention given his age and history of respiratory issues. Alongside this, concerns about his declining blood levels prompted an urgent series of blood transfusions to combat anemia, a condition that had been exacerbating his weakness in recent months. Though medical staff were working relentlessly, Vatican officials were careful in their public communications, striving to maintain a tone of reassurance while acknowledging the gravity of the situation. Statements from Vatican spokespersons stressed that the Pope remained conscious and alert despite his fragile state. Reports circulated that he had even managed to acknowledge the medical team treating him, his mind still engaged despite the physical toll on his body. Nevertheless, behind closed doors, high-ranking clergy and advisors were engaged in hushed discussions about the implications of this latest health crisis. The Vatican was no stranger to speculation, and with Pope Francis now in critical condition, the whispers of uncertainty only grew louder. As news of the Pope's hospitalization spread, reactions from around the world flooded in. Political leaders, religious figures, and ordinary believers alike took to social media and public forums to express their concern. From the balconies of St. Peter's Square, cardinals appeared before gathered crowds, urging prayers and faith in God's plan. Masses were held in Rome and across the globe, as the faithful sought divine intervention for the ailing pontiff. World leaders also issued statements of solidarity. The President of Italy, Sergio Mattarella, called Pope Francis a beacon of moral guidance and expressed hope for his swift recovery. The President of the United States, along with several European leaders, conveyed their wishes for his well-being, highlighting his influence beyond the spiritual realm. Leaders from predominantly Catholic nations in Latin America, where Pope Francis had strong ties due to his Argentine heritage, held candlelight vigils and prayer sessions. Meanwhile, within the Vatican itself, preparations were quietly underway for all possible outcomes. Though official statements maintained optimism, Vatican officials were acutely aware of the weight of the moment. The history of the Church had seen many transitions of power, yet each new crisis brought its own unique challenges. If Pope Francis' condition worsened, the question of succession would become unavoidable, a subject that many were already considering behind the scenes. Despite these undercurrents of uncertainty, the world remained fixated on the latest updates from Gemelli Hospital. Crowds outside its gates grew in number, a mix of journalists, pilgrims, and concerned onlookers waiting for any developments. In the digital sphere, speculation ran rampant, with many questioning whether the Vatican was fully disclosing the severity of the Pope's condition. Some believed that the crisis was being downplayed to prevent panic within the Catholic community, while others theorized that hidden power struggles within the church hierarchy were already shaping the narrative around his health. For now, Pope Francis lay in his hospital bed, surrounded by the hum of medical monitors and the quiet urgency of doctors who understood the significance of their patient. The Vatican's future, and the direction of the global Catholic Church, hung in the balance as the world held its breath, waiting for the next chapter in the unfolding drama of Pope Francis' fate. Pope Francis' latest health crisis was not an isolated event but rather the culmination of years of ongoing medical concerns that had long been a subject of both internal Vatican deliberations and public speculation. His respiratory issues had been persistent, dating back to his youth when a severe infection had led to the removal of part of one lung. Though he had managed to carry out his papal duties with remarkable endurance, the past few years had seen a decline in his physical stamina, marked by recurring bouts of bronchitis, shortness of breath, and hospital visits that raised concerns about his long-term well-being. His hospitalization at Rome's Gemelli Hospital earlier in the year for bronchial infections had been described as a precautionary measure, yet those close to the Vatican knew that his struggle with respiratory complications was intensifying. Observers had noted the increasing frailty in his public appearances, the growing reliance on aides to assist him in standing, and his frequent use of a wheelchair. His already weakened immune system, coupled with anemia, had further exacerbated his vulnerability, making him susceptible to even minor illnesses. Those who had closely followed his medical history were not entirely surprised by the latest emergency, though the severity of the situation had sent shockwaves through the Church. While the Vatican had consistently assured the public that Pope Francis was receiving the best possible medical care, murmurs of concern had long been circulating among Vatican insiders. Some questioned whether his health had been mismanaged or, worse, intentionally downplayed to maintain the image of strength and continuity within the Church. These whispers had only grown louder in the wake of his latest crisis. Behind the grand halls of the Apostolic Palace, there were those who believed that Pope Francis had been urged to continue his rigorous schedule despite his failing health. His demanding international visits, relentless workload, and insistence on direct involvement in church affairs had taken a visible toll, and some argued that Vatican officials had ignored warning signs in order to prevent internal instability. There was an unspoken fear among high-ranking clergy that admitting the Pope's fragility could weaken confidence in his leadership, potentially leading to chaos among factions vying for influence. The secrecy surrounding papal health matters was not without precedent. The Vatican had a long history of keeping the true extent of a pope's medical condition hidden from the public eye. Pope John Paul II's battle with Parkinson's disease had been concealed for years, and even Pope Benedict XVI's declining health had been carefully managed before his unexpected resignation. In Pope Francis' case, some believed that a similar strategy was at play, his worsening condition deliberately downplayed to avoid speculation about succession or potential power shifts. Yet, beyond theories of neglect, darker suspicions had begun to take hold. In the echoing corridors of the Vatican and among certain circles of Catholic scholars, a far more sinister possibility was being whispered: was Pope Francis' illness entirely natural, or had external forces played a hand in accelerating his decline? To some, the idea seemed outrageous, but for those who had watched his papacy closely, it was not beyond the realm of possibility. Pope Francis had been a reformer, a figure unafraid to challenge deeply entrenched traditions and power structures within the Church. His progressive stances on issues such as LGBTQ+ rights, climate change, and economic inequality had made him a polarizing figure, drawing both admiration and fierce opposition. He had pushed for transparency in church finances, cracked down on corruption, and sought to hold clergy accountable for decades of abuse scandals. In doing so, he had made powerful enemies, not only within the Church but also among political and financial elites who saw his influence as a threat to their own interests. There were those who speculated that his sudden respiratory crisis was not merely the result of his existing ailments but perhaps something more deliberate. Was it possible that he had been exposed to a virus, a toxin, or some other external factor designed to weaken him further? The Vatican, with its labyrinthine politics and long history of secrecy, had been the backdrop for countless conspiracies over the centuries. The notion that a pope could be deliberately incapacitated, while unsettling, was not unthinkable to those who had studied the Church's past. Adding to the speculation were reports of unusual activity within the Vatican in the weeks leading up to his hospitalization. Increased security, unexplained delays in papal appearances, and abrupt schedule changes had fueled questions about whether something had been brewing behind the scenes. Some Vatican staff had privately expressed concerns that the Pope had seemed unusually fatigued in recent months, with unconfirmed accounts suggesting that he had been advised to rest more but had continued to push himself. Further fueling the mystery was the lack of detailed medical disclosures. While the Vatican had issued statements emphasizing that the Pope was conscious and receiving care, they had been vague about the exact cause of the crisis. This absence of transparency had led to rampant speculation, with some questioning whether there was more to the story than officials were willing to reveal. As the world waited for updates on Pope Francis' condition, these theories, ranging from simple neglect to deliberate foul play, continued to spread. Whether rooted in genuine concern or paranoia, they all underscored one undeniable truth: the Pope's health was not merely a private matter but one that held immense implications for the future of the Catholic Church. Within the walls of the Vatican, high-ranking officials grappled with their next moves. If the Pope's condition worsened, would they be prepared for the consequences? If he recovered, would he address the swirling rumors himself? And if his health had indeed been compromised by external forces, would the truth ever see the light of day? For now, the answers remained elusive. But one thing was clear: this was not just a health crisis. It was a moment of reckoning, one that would test the very foundations of Vatican power. As Pope Francis lay in critical condition within the walls of Rome's Gemelli Hospital, the Vatican itself had become a theater of silent but intense maneuvering. The fate of the papacy was now uncertain, and with that uncertainty came a power vacuum that had been years in the making. Behind the public facade of unity and prayerful concern, high-ranking cardinals and church officials were already weighing their next moves. The question of succession was no longer a distant hypothetical, it was an imminent reality, and with it, the ideological future of the Catholic Church hung in the balance. The College of Cardinals, the body responsible for electing the next pope, had long been divided into factions. On one side stood those who had supported Pope Francis' vision for the Church, his progressive stance on social issues, his push for economic justice, and his calls for greater transparency. These figures, mostly drawn from Latin America, Africa, and parts of Europe, saw Francis as a necessary reformer, a pope who had sought to modernize an institution burdened by centuries of rigid traditions. On the other side, however, were the traditionalists, cardinals who had viewed Francis' tenure with growing unease. Many of them had remained silent in public but had been quietly working to restore what they saw as the Church's rightful order. To them, Francis had been a disruptive force, an unorthodox pope whose emphasis on mercy over doctrine had dangerously eroded the Church's foundational teachings. His willingness to reconsider issues such as divorced Catholics receiving communion, his cautious openness toward LGBTQ+ individuals, and his insistence on addressing climate change and economic inequality were seen as deviations from sacred priorities. These cardinals had waited patiently for their opportunity, and now, with Francis on the brink, their moment had arrived. The battle lines had been drawn long before this crisis. The Synod of Bishops, held in the years prior, had revealed deep fissures within the church hierarchy. There had been murmurs that a counterforce was gathering, a coalition of cardinals seeking to ensure that Francis' successor would be someone more aligned with traditional Catholic values. Among them were powerful figures such as Cardinal Raymond Burke, an outspoken critic of Francis, and Cardinal Robert Sarah, who had repeatedly warned against what he perceived as the Church's drift toward secularism. Though both had been sidelined by Francis during his reign, their influence remained strong among conservative circles. Yet, the reformists were not without their own champions. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican's Secretary of State, had been one of Francis' most trusted advisors and was seen as a potential bridge between progressives and traditionalists. Other figures, such as Cardinal Matteo Zuppi of Italy and Cardinal Luis Tagle of the Philippines, were viewed as continuations of Francis' vision, a new generation of leaders willing to embrace change while maintaining the Church's spiritual core. As the Pope's health crisis unfolded, these factions were already meeting in private, forming alliances, and testing loyalties. Some whispered that backroom discussions had begun even before Francis had been hospitalized, as rumors of his deteriorating health had circulated for months. In the absence of an official transition, the power struggle had taken on a clandestine character, meetings held behind closed doors, whispered conversations in Vatican corridors, and discreet inquiries into where loyalties lay. What made this struggle even more complex was the unresolved issue of Pope Benedict XVI's precedent. The former pope had shocked the world when he voluntarily abdicated in 2013, a move almost unheard of in modern times. Francis himself had hinted in recent years that he, too, might step down if his health no longer allowed him to govern effectively. Now, with his condition precarious, some wondered whether he had been preparing for such an eventuality all along. If he recovered, would he announce his resignation, setting the stage for yet another unprecedented transition? If he did not, would the traditionalists seize the opportunity to shape the future of the Church before the reformists could rally? Beyond the Vatican walls, the political implications of a new papacy were already being considered. Pope Francis had been a global figure not just in religious circles but in diplomatic and political ones as well. His outspokenness on climate change had earned him admiration from international leaders but scorn from climate change skeptics. His calls for economic justice had made him a friend of the poor but a critic of global capitalism. His cautious stance on migration and refugee rights had placed him at odds with nationalist governments in Europe and the Americas. A successor aligned with the conservative faction could reverse many of these positions, signaling a shift that would have repercussions far beyond the Church itself. The Catholic Church, with its 1.3 billion followers, remained one of the most influential institutions in the world. Its leader had the power to shape discussions on morality, ethics, and policy on a global scale. A more conservative pope could reassert rigid doctrinal teachings, strengthening the Church's stance against issues such as abortion, same-sex marriage, and the role of women in the clergy. A progressive successor, on the other hand, could push the Church further toward inclusivity, making room for more modern interpretations of Catholic doctrine. The uncertainty of the moment had sent ripples through religious communities worldwide. In Latin America, where Francis' influence was strongest, there were concerns that his departure could mark the decline of the region's representation in Vatican leadership. In Africa, where the Catholic Church was growing rapidly, there were calls for the next pope to come from the continent, a historic first that could redefine the Church's global priorities. In Europe, where the Church had been struggling to maintain its relevance, traditionalists hoped that a more conservative pope could revive waning faith. While the world prayed for Pope Francis' recovery, those within the Vatican understood that his fate was no longer just a matter of health. It was a matter of power, ideology, and the very future of the Catholic Church. The race for succession was already underway, and the outcome would determine not just the next pope, but the direction in which the Church would move for decades to come. For now, the Vatican remained in a delicate state of waiting. But beneath the solemn prayers and official reassurances, the battle had already begun. As the world anxiously awaited updates on Pope Francis' condition, an unsettling atmosphere took hold within the Vatican. What had initially seemed like a straightforward medical crisis was beginning to take on a more mysterious tone. Reports of tightened security, unusual movements within the Holy See, and closed-door meetings fueled speculation that something far greater was at play. The Vatican's history of secrecy had long been a source of intrigue, but this time, the silence felt different, more deliberate, more calculated. Eyewitnesses within Vatican City spoke of increased security measures that had been implemented almost overnight. The Swiss Guard, typically present as a ceremonial force, had been reinforced with Vatican gendarmerie units, whose presence was usually reserved for moments of high alert. Unauthorized personnel were barred from key areas of the Apostolic Palace, and even high-ranking clergy found their usual access restricted. Journalists stationed outside St. Peter's Square noticed the shift almost immediately, an increase in surveillance, a hesitancy from Vatican spokespeople to answer direct questions, and an eerie sense that the full truth was being kept from the public. Rumors spread quickly that the Vatican was concealing the severity of Pope Francis' condition. Official statements continued to assure the world that he was conscious and alert, but insiders suggested otherwise. Whispers circulated that his condition had dramatically worsened, that he had slipped in and out of consciousness, and that discussions regarding the governance of the Church in his absence had already begun. The Vatican had a long history of carefully controlling the narrative surrounding papal health, but the level of secrecy surrounding Francis' hospitalization was more intense than many had ever seen. Further fueling speculation were reports of secret meetings among high-ranking clergy and influential figures within the Church. Late-night gatherings in the Vatican's administrative offices, discreet visits from cardinals who had not been publicly scheduled to be in Rome, and an unusual influx of diplomatic envoys suggested that something significant was unfolding behind closed doors. Some suspected these were routine contingency discussions, plans for a conclave in the event of the Pope's passing. Others, however, believed these meetings were not about preparing for the inevitable, but about orchestrating it. Theories of internal power plays intensified as news spread that key conservative figures had convened privately. While no official announcements had been made, those who had closely followed Vatican politics recognized the signs of strategic positioning. If Pope Francis was unable to recover, or if he stepped down, his successor would be chosen from among the College of Cardinals, a body deeply divided between reformists and traditionalists. The secrecy surrounding these gatherings suggested that major decisions were being made, perhaps even before the Pope's fate was fully determined. Beyond the political intrigue, a more unsettling theory began to emerge, one that tied Pope Francis' condition to something far more ominous. In certain circles, whispers of prophecy had begun to spread. The idea that Francis' papacy had been foretold as the last in a long lineage of popes was not new, but recent events had given it newfound weight. One of the most infamous prophecies linked to the Vatican was the so-called prophecy of the popes, attributed to Saint Malachy, a 12th-century Irish bishop who claimed to have received a vision detailing the future leaders of the Catholic Church. According to this prophecy, each pope was assigned a cryptic motto, and the final entry on the list referred to a pope described as Petrus Romanus, the last pope, under whose reign the Church would face great tribulation and ultimately fall. Many had dismissed the prophecy as apocryphal, but Francis' ascension had reignited interest in it, especially among those who believed that his progressive stance was leading the Church into a period of internal collapse. The idea that Francis could be the last pope had long been debated, but now, with his health failing and the Vatican in a state of secrecy, apocalyptic theories gained traction. Some pointed to biblical references, others to more recent Marian apparitions that warned of crises within the Church. The timing of his illness, coming amid growing internal divisions and global unrest, only fueled the belief that his papacy marked the beginning of something far greater than a simple transition of power. Outside the Vatican, these theories took hold in religious circles and among conspiracy theorists alike. On social media, discussions ranged from serious theological debates to wild speculation about hidden documents within the Vatican archives that supposedly contained warnings about the end of the Church as it had been known. Some believed that a faction within the Vatican was working to hasten this outcome, either by ensuring Francis' removal or by manipulating the succession to bring about a pope who would either restore or destroy the Church's influence. Among the faithful, these fears played out in different ways. In St. Peter's Square, thousands gathered, not just to pray for the Pope's recovery, but to seek reassurance that their church would endure. In cathedrals around the world, urgent sermons were delivered, urging Catholics to remain steadfast in faith even as uncertainty loomed. Some viewed Francis as a martyr, a pope who had fought to modernize the Church and was now paying the price for it. Others sought his struggles as divine punishment for having strayed too far from traditional doctrine. Inside the Vatican, those who understood its inner workings knew that secrecy was a powerful tool. By withholding information, the Holy See controlled not just the narrative, but the reaction. It was unclear whether they were concealing the true extent of Francis' illness to prevent panic, or if something far more deliberate was unfolding. The heightened security, the secret meetings, and the rumors of prophetic warnings all pointed to one undeniable fact: something was happening behind the Vatican's walls, something the world was not yet meant to see. As the days stretched on and updates on the Pope's condition remained vague, tension grew. The Vatican had always been a place of mystery, but this time, the mystery felt heavier. Whether Pope Francis recovered or not, it was clear that forces within the Church were already moving, shaping the future in ways the public could only speculate about. And for those who believed in the weight of prophecy, one question lingered above all others: was this truly the end of an era? As the world remained on edge, waiting for updates on Pope Francis' condition, a quiet battle between hope and despair played out among those closest to the situation. Inside Gemelli Hospital, his medical team worked relentlessly, balancing optimism with caution. While some reports suggested that the Pope was responding to treatment, others hinted at complications, with conflicting accounts from Vatican insiders fueling speculation. The official statements from the Vatican maintained a tone of reassurance, insisting that Pope Francis remained alert and stable despite the gravity of his condition. Yet, those familiar with the Church's long history of controlling narratives knew better than to take these reports at face value. The slow trickle of information, the tightened security, and the whispers of secret meetings suggested that the Vatican was preparing for all possible outcomes, including the worst. Beyond the walls of the Holy See, the Catholic world braced for what might come next. The possibility of a papal transition loomed large, and with it, the question of whether the Church would continue on its current path or undergo a dramatic shift. Pope Francis had been a defining figure, a reformer who had sought to modernize the institution in ways that had sparked both admiration and fierce resistance. If he recovered, would he return to lead with even greater urgency, pushing through reforms that had stalled in the face of opposition? Or would his near-death experience prompt him to step down, leaving the Church in the hands of his successor? For those who feared his departure, the concern was not just about losing a leader but about the ideological battle his absence would trigger. If Francis were to die, the selection of the next pope would be pivotal, determining whether the Church continued its progressive trajectory or reverted to its more traditional roots. The conservative faction, long critical of Francis' reforms, was already maneuvering, hoping to steer the Church back toward stricter doctrine. A successor aligned with their views could roll back some of Francis' most ambitious changes, reinforcing rigid theological positions on issues such as LGBTQ+ inclusion, celibacy for priests, and the role of women in the Church. Beyond theology, the political implications of a new pope were equally profound. Francis had positioned himself as a global moral leader, taking strong stances on climate change, economic justice, and the rights of migrants and refugees. His departure could shift the Church's influence in international affairs, especially if his successor adopted a less politically engaged approach. The Vatican's relationships with world governments, from the United States to China, could be reshaped by a new pope's priorities. Would the Church remain a vocal advocate for the marginalized, or would it retreat from its role as a force for social change? As the speculation swirled, another question loomed over the Vatican: what secrets might be revealed in the wake of Pope Francis' crisis? The Church had always been a fortress of hidden knowledge, from the sealed archives containing centuries-old documents to the unspoken agreements among its highest officials. If Francis recovered, would he break the silence on some of these mysteries? His papacy had already been marked by a push for transparency, but some suspected that he had held back on certain revelations to avoid further conflict within the Church. If his survival led him to believe he had nothing left to lose, could he finally expose truths that had remained hidden for generations? Conversely, if he did not recover, what secrets might emerge in his absence? Death often had a way of bringing hidden matters to light, especially within an institution as steeped in tradition and secrecy as the Vatican. Would documents be leaked, exposing previously unknown struggles within the Church? Would those who had opposed him finally speak freely, revealing internal conflicts that had been carefully managed while he was alive? Or would his passing prompt an even greater effort to suppress controversial information, ensuring that his legacy remained controlled? Among the faithful, the uncertainty was both spiritual and existential. For some, Pope Francis' struggle was a test of faith, a moment that called for prayer and trust in divine intervention. For others, it was a sign of deeper troubles within the Church, an indication that the institution was at a crossroads with no clear path forward. Some believers feared that his death would mark the beginning of a more divided and weakened Church, one in which factions fought openly for control. Others saw it as an opportunity for renewal, a chance to redefine Catholicism for a changing world. As the Vatican remained silent on what would come next, the speculation grew louder. Would Pope Francis return to his place at the helm, guiding the Church through what remained of his tenure? Would he step aside, acknowledging that his time as leader had come to an end? Or would history mark his crisis as the final chapter of an era, the moment that set into motion changes that could not be undone. For now, there were no clear answers, only the weight of uncertainty. The fate of Pope Francis, and with it, the future of the Catholic Church, remained suspended between hope and inevitability. What happened next would not just determine the leadership of the Church, it would shape its very soul for generations to come.